Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to episode 4 of the Heavy Pen Podcast, the show where I speak in an empty room to you about storytelling, why it's cool, and how we should handle it responsibly. Welcome back. Once again, I am your host, Christian. I don't know why I said that in such a needlessly strange way. But yes, it is once again me, your host, Christian, and today we're talking about storytelling once again. We're actually, our theme today, I'm very excited to do. I was very excited to do this one. I'm going to come back to this theme at least one other time in the future, because I really, really enjoy this, and, there's a lot to talk about here. What am I talking about? Christian, you haven't mentioned the theme for today's episode. Today we're talking about fan content. And yeah, that might be making a couple of you kind of tilt your heads to the side and be like, wait, what do you mean fan content? Well, when I am talking about fan content, I am talking about fan content. I'm talking about, fan art, fan fiction, I was about to say fan canon. It's just called fanon. All of that stuff. The things that people create when they consume the stuff that other people create based off of the stuff that those other people created. If that wasn't confusing, it was supposed to be. So congratulations, you understood something that was intentionally supposed to be annoying. But yeah, we're talking about fan content. What is even that? What do I mean when I say we're talking about fan content? I mean, I just got so distracted. I know you can't hear it because it was on my computer, but it just sent like the big notification sound, the doo-doo-doo-doo or the doo-doo-doo-doo sound. And it just completely derailed my train of thought. Anyway, back to fan stuff. It did it again. Why are we talking about fan content? What does that have to do with anything about storytelling and all of that? Well, I'm glad you asked that. So why are we talking about all of this? Fan content is this really fun thing. I have this, not a theory really, it's a way I kind of look at how kind of stories influence each other, this generational model that I'll probably get into at some point in the future if I ever codify it into a thing I could explain. But it's this very, very fun concept of stories and, unofficial content that are kind of birthed from the effects that a creator has on the people who consume their things. You like something so much that you make something based directly off of it. It's different from inspiration in that, if I go out to make, what's a good example of this? I guess Firefly. Okay, so I've heard Firefly is based off of Star Wars, or not based off, it was inspired by Star Wars. I do not actually know if this is true because I have not seen Firefly. This is what I've heard, so we're going to go off of that. Firefly takes inspiration from Star Wars, whereas, there are so many popular fan projects for Star Wars, and I can't remember a single one of them. Any painting that you see someone make of Darth Vader, that's fan content. That is an unofficial thing that a person made that is directly connected to this thing that they like. Why am I explaining fan content, you might be asking? Because it's useful to explain what exactly I'm talking about before we really dive into talking about it. But yeah, so fan content is just, you like something, or maybe in some rare cases you hate it so much that you basically just create another thing of that thing that you like. It's not really cloning, but it's kind of cloning. It's this really interesting thing. The more I'm thinking about it, I'm like, it's kind of not as... It might just be because I'm very spacey right now. It should be way easier for me to just explain than it is, but I'm tripping over all my words and thoughts. But yeah, basically, you make something directly connected to a thing, whether that be you write a story set in someone else's fictional world, whether you make a drawing of characters you did not create, or anything like that. There's actually I was about to mention music. We're gonna talk about that like kind of genre of music in this episode in a bit. But yeah, so that's kind of the what. Why am I talking about it? Because it's a flavor of storytelling. I'm talking about it because it's a flavor of storytelling, and also because it's very, 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 very cool. The last thing, I guess, that I'll hit on before we dive into everything is, why do I think it's cool? I just 2 seconds ago said I think it's very, very cool. Why is it very, very cool? Now, this is not necessarily a universal thing, because everyone who creates, every artist, every storyteller, yada, 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 does it for different reasons. They take different joys out of the act. For me, I really enjoy the effect that the things I make have on people. I enjoy when, I've written something or, whatever, and I get to see or like hear about the fact that someone consumed that thing and they really, really liked it. And like kind of seeing that spark of enjoyment, that spark of like, oh, this thing really connected with me. And I'm like super, super in love with it. Or like, that spark. The spark is the most important thing. That is the thing that I think makes the most sense of what I'm talking about. Anyway, yeah, so I really love seeing that spark go off in people. And, whenever that spark goes off in me, it's huge. I really enjoy it. Like when I latch on to something, I really latch on. So, when that spark lights a flame, it's always cool to see how that flame manifests. Sometimes, those flames will go on to just inspire people to make other things. You'll have your, in this example, we're talking about Firefly. But there's like 100 things which are like loosely inspired by Star Wars. I actually have a decent amount of things that I have created, which, Star Wars is one of their very, very huge, very, very large inspirations. If you can't tell, I like Star Wars a lot. So that's why that's the thing I keep going back to. I had a point. Sparks, right. The other way that the spark, or that flame, rather, will manifest, will go, is into generating fan content. Sometimes the things that inspire you don't necessarily inspire you to go outside of that universe. It inspires you to reinterpret that world, that universe that has kind of connected with you in another way. Whether that just be, you draw a picture, whether that be you write a story, whether that be you even, make like an entire comic based off of something that you enjoy. Actually, something came off the top of my head for that. I think it's the Archie comics for Sonic. For those of you who are really into Sonic, I'm pretty certain that that's all unofficial. I also think there's a ton of it. Like some person or group of people made an entire comic series about Sonic the Hedgehog. And I've heard it's very good. And that's completely fan content. And it's like really, really cool. So yeah, that's why we're talking about it. That's why it's cool, because it is a genre or a category of storytelling which is specifically about reinterpreting, recontextualizing, kind of recreating. That's the word. Recreating stuff that we enjoy kind of through our own eyes. Taking a thing that someone else made and reinterpreting it through how we are kind of seeing it. So yeah, that's kind of that's the who, the what, and the why. So let's kind of really get into some like questions. So the first thing that I want to kind of focus on is kind of from the behind the curtain standpoint. So not even talking about fan creators yet. We're talking about the people who create the things. So how should we, the people who create the things, think about fan content? How should we think about, people making stuff based off of our things? I was about to say IPs, and I don't know. The phrase didn't feel right on my tongue. So we're not going to talk about it like intellectual property. We're going to talk about it like things we create. So how should we as creators really look at fan content? Now, full disclosure, I have a bit of a bias in this because I've seen a lot of really cool fan content and I really like it. But there's really no completely, there's no complete 100% answer to this question of like, how should we as creators view people who create derivative works? That's the word. Derivation. I cannot believe I couldn't think of that earlier. But yeah, how should we, as the primary creators, look at people who make derivative works or, fan content? Now, my skewed opinion, my personal opinion, is I think that we should embrace it wholeheartedly. I think that fan content, like, enabling fandom and stuff, can, first off, is just typically, from what I've seen, very good for the lifespan of anything. Take like Steven Universe, a show that was very solid, had a lot of good, had a lot of not great, but, lives and dies by the strength of its fan base. And, it has extenuating circumstances to why that fan base became as strong as it was and all that yada yada. But like, it is hard to deny the fact that Steven Universe has a really powerful fan base. I also mentioned Sonic. It's another one with a very, very famously dedicated fan base, in a lot of good and bad ways. I think that, personally, before we get into like the kind of more objective thing, I think that embracing fan content, letting fans do things, is typically for the better, because there's a lot of good that can come out of that, and if nothing else, it enables people who like what you have made to keep enjoying it even after you've stopped making it, which can also take pressure off of you, the primary creator, because let's just be very real for a second. Sometimes you will end a story and people really want more, but you are done. You've completed it, you're whatever, and you've moved on. You shouldn't bend to the whims of your fan base when you have a vision for this story, or the story's going a certain way, and then it ends, or whatever. Like, you shouldn't bend to the whims of a fan base, because you're the one creating the story, and at the end of the day, what you say kind of goes. As soon as I said that, I had an immediate flashback to a really annoying example of kind of this not being done, where creators did kind of bend to the fan base for what I would believe to be a negative overall. Well, at some point we will talk about RWBY. I don't know if we're going to talk about RWBY right now. I mean, now that I've mentioned it, we probably will. I love RWBY. I'm a huge RWBY fan. And there are things that RWBY did early on that I think they shouldn't have, but we're not going to get into that right now. We're talking about how should we view fan content. Enabling fan content, leaning into it, from my personal perspective, can be really good, really beneficial for creators, because at the very least, it gives the people who want more of your thing or want a specific thing out of your thing a place to vent that desire that's not directly at you. Kind of think about shipping. Shipping is a really fun thing that, I engage in fandom occasionally, or not so much recently, but I used to. And, shipping was a fun thing to do. It's like, oh, I really like how these characters are written. Like, I like how these characters move and interact with each other. And I think, like, if they were to get into a relationship, whatever sort of relationship that is, typically romantic, I think that they would have, like, a really interesting dynamic. And then they get to kind of interpret that and have fun with that. I think as a primary creator, kind of letting that happen has a lot of merit. I think there's a lot of cool things that other people can make by interpreting your work through that. And at the very least, it gives people ports to vent the desire for this thing that aren't at you. And I don't know. I personally think giving people as many other directions to be like, oh, I want this specific thing in your, thing that you're making that isn't directly at you, I think giving them as many places to do that is a really good idea. But yeah, kind of getting out of my own personal opinion, moving towards a slightly more objective thing. How should we look at fan content? I still think, even to an objective degree, that we should never do our best to banish it. Like, I don't think, for the most part, that crushing fan content is good because it discourages people from becoming fans of your work. A lot of people, myself included, have gotten into certain things just through stuff like the fan base has created. It's like, oh, that's cool. I wonder, what inspired that? Like, why do people resonate with this so powerfully that they've created this, like, cool story or this cool artwork or this cool song or whatever? Now, there is something to be said about moderating fan content, which I do agree. I forget who it was, which is upsetting because this is a really great example. But there was someone who was like, yeah, no, I'm just not comfortable with people making explicit. I don't think that's how the word explicit is supposed to be used, but it's how we use it. Not safe for work variations of their characters, which is a thing that people do. This is another kind of... I hesitate to lump this in with the overall thing of fan content, despite the fact that is kind of what it is, just because I don't like it. But yeah, there was, I forget who this was specifically, but they were like, I'm not comfortable with that. I don't like that. And I think they had like their publisher or someone kind of cracking down on people who were doing that. Now, before I even talk about, do I think that was a good idea? Are they within their rights to do that? Yes, it is their thing. They have the rights to it. And if they don't want to see a certain type of thing, they have the legal right to say, don't do that. Do I think it's a good idea? No, because when you put that kind of pressure on people, it will either nudge some people away, and maybe those aren't people that you want consuming it in the first place, which is a completely different conversation to be had. But it also does frustrate. Like, it's a frustrating image to have because it makes you seem very authoritarian. I don't think that person's being authoritarian. I think that that's pretty reasonable. I also wouldn't be super happy if, like, I saw, like, one of my characters getting looted. I think that's the term. But, cracking down on stuff like that, it can give you a certain image. And, in another more objective thing, you do want to be maintaining your image to, like, still be marketable. I know that in I don't remember if this was the last episode or maybe this was episode 2, I talked about how much I really dislike thinking about it from the terms of marketing, and I do. But on the business side, there is a certain amount of image maintaining that you want to do. So how should we regard fan content as creators? Regard it however you want, but be aware that the enabling of it will draw people into your fan base, but, you want to be careful what you enable because you don't want your fan base to get kind of out of control. Moderating your fan base is a good thing to do, that you are within your rights to do. Do it wisely and try not to be too crazy about it, but definitely do it. You made this for a specific audience, and you want that audience that you wanted to read this to enjoy it the way that you wanted them to enjoy it, instead of getting pushed off by weird people who are twisting it in a way you didn't want. Yeah, I said a lot there. I threw a lot of ideas out in the wall, but that's kind of like my general thing is like, approach it however you want to. Just be aware that, like, the more leeway you give, the more people will get drawn in, but more is not always better. I think that's kind of a good way to sum that up. But, yeah, how should we regard fan content? I think that it's cool, but there's moderation that sometimes needs to be done. Now, let's flip that coin real quick. How should fanfic creators approach things they want to make fan content of? Now, this is, and I will fully admit, kind of a touchy, maybe not touchy. I see this as kind of a delicate question to ask because I'm basically saying, hey, you like something enough that you want to make something about it. What restrictions should you put on yourself for something that you are making for yourself, for the most part, probably, about a thing that you like? So, I mean, once again, in a very, very serious way, the answer to this question is you don't really need to. Like, you can do whatever you want and no one can stop you because this is you expressing your creativity just through the lens of something that someone else created. So in a very real sense, no one can really say anything to you about that. However, I think that as fan content creators, we should be mindful of the sorts of things that the original creator of a thing wants. Like, I'm trying to think of a good example of this. I can't really think of like an analogy. I'm always trying to make up analogies and they come out very weird. But like, yeah, I think that we should be mindful. I do say we. I have engaged in fan content creation before because it's fun. Like, I do think that we should be mindful of like the desires of the original creator. Now, am I saying, oh, if the original creator, did like a slice of life and you wanted to write those characters in a war story, should you not do that because it was slice of life? No, I think that might be taking it a little far. For the most part, I think you can basically do mostly whatever you want and not really have to worry about it. And if you do end up going against the desires of the creator accidentally, I don't think you've done anything wrong. Like, if you know that the original creator like has some reason to not want certain things done with their characters, I would say it's nice to be considerate of that. And once again, I'm a person on the internet who's talking to you through a speaker, however far away that I may or may not be from you. That's, I'm not your parents. I'm not the federal government. I can't make you do anything. You are going to do whatever you're going to do. This entire podcast is just putting thoughts to consider in your head. So the thought that I'm putting into your head to consider right now is, I think you should be mindful of what the original creators like are uncomfortable with, because, in a very real sense, you are kind of taking not their children, but you're taking their stuff and you're scrambling it around. And while that's still a very cool thing that you do, and I think you're awesome for wanting to do it, there are things to like consider, boundaries to not necessarily cross just because that would be a nice thing to do, Like, think of it if it was you and you made a thing and then someone turned it into something else. That's not a reflection on you, but it probably would make you feel a little uncomfortable, especially like with the knowledge that like that might be someone's first exposure to your thing. So, like I said, to original creators, how it's like, be aware, cultivate it in the direction that you want it to go. For fan creators, I would say, hey, be aware of the wishes of the original creators and, don't prevent yourself from doing something that you think would be interesting, but at the same time, don't go out of your way to do something that you are aware would grieve the original creator. And, there's a lot of... Saying this about fan content is really difficult because it's like, oh, but like, what about like AU stuff and all of that? Like stuff where you're going so far beyond the like boundaries of the original property that you are essentially just doing a completely new thing. And I would still say like, be aware of like what boundaries the original creator would prefer with that. But like, again, there's so much leeway when it comes to fan content that it's literally just a like, hey, being aware is kind of all you need to do. And even then, whatever you're working on might be so far outside of the wheelhouse of the original version of this thing you're working with that it might not matter. Which is a really frustrating answer. I realize I've kind of said, be mindful, but at the same time, you might not need to. So I'm going to sum it up by saying, be mindful and do whatever you're going to do while being mindful. And that's kind of it. Be mindful while you work. Hooey! I went so much longer on that, and there are so many other things to go. I have like a list of questions to go down. I actually kind of jumped through a couple of them, which is really nice. I'm actually very happy with that. Okay. So let's jump down to straight up. All right. This transition noises and all that, yada, yada, yada. This kind of content of collaboration. So why is fan content cool? What is it kind of representative of? Why is it neat? So I have written down here, collaboration and iteration are the ways we grow. And this is true. I mentioned earlier this, like, not codified model of like generational stories that I have kind of in my head and that I look at things through. What I mean by that, I'm just going to explain the formation of this idea, and hopefully that'll like kind of illustrate what I'm saying. So this idea came into my head when I was kind of looking at the evolution of certain Disney shows. I think it was specifically Disney XD. It was Wander Over Yonder to, I think it was Wander Over Yonder straight to Gravity Falls, and maybe Gravity Falls and Star vs. the Force of Evil, and then Gravity Falls to Amphibia and the Owl House. So the reason that was like the chart that I drew was because people who worked on Wander Over Yonder went and worked on Star vs. the Force of Evil and Gravity Falls. And then people from Gravity Falls went and they were working on Amphibia and the Owl House. And you can see elements of each of those shows higher up on the genealogy tree present in the shows that kind of come after it. Like you see ideas and like kind of fingerprints. Like you see traces of the DNA, which is why I use the generational things. Like Wander Over Yonder is kind of the parent of Star and Gravity Falls, and then, so on and so forth with Amphibia and the Owl House. Now, yes, you can say, oh, it's just because like they were all Disney animators who, follow within the Disney formula, and that was just like a different permutation of the Disney formula for that specific group of people. Yeah, that's true. But also, you can't say that there's like no influences from Wander Over Yonder and Star vs. the Forces of Evil. Like I haven't really seen Wander Over Yonder, but like I can still see some of the traces, like the certain level of wackiness, how it's expressed and all of that, how certain characters are, and the art style. The art style is the kind of thing that I'll completely be like, yeah, no, that's just how they're all trained. It's like the Cal Arts style, just variations of that. But even with me hand waving that, no, there are like examples that you can kind of see of like the effects of the previous show on the others. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about like this genealogy, this generational model of like how stories evolve. And fan content is another kind of example of this. So obviously everyone who creates has been inspired by something, and everything they create will have been inspired in part by those things. You look into anything, literally anything, and you will see examples of that. Like, for example, which I know that most of you listening to this will understand, if you've ever consumed fantasy, just ever straight up and down, you can see the effects of Lord of the Rings on fantasy. Basically, all of modern fantasy exists in the context of Lord of the Rings and a couple other things, but Lord of the Rings is the main one. Like, I think it's there's two types of fantasy. There is Tolkien-esque fantasy and specifically not Tolkien-esque fantasy. Like I've heard, like Brandon Sanderson, huge fantasy writer. I've heard people call him like the next Tolkien, not because he writes like Tolkien. He's just like a huge epic fantasy writer. But like the fact that that is what some people call him should kind of clue you into this fact that like, hey, we exist in a Tolkien context within fantasy. And sci-fi has some of those things as well. Not specifically just Star Wars, although that is definitely huge, but there's other stuff like Star Trek. There's a bunch of other ones. I'm not super familiar with all of them. I almost said Tron. I don't know that Tron has directly inspired a ton, which is a shame because Tron is awesome. But, there are examples of that. Like, you will see if you really start looking, like, the, little bits and pieces from stuff that have inspired the things that you're finding those bits and pieces in. And fan content's a very, very huge example of that. So what does that mean? Like, why does that matter? So one of the reasons I think fan content is really cool is because it's kind of a direct example of this idea of collaboration and iteration. Collaboration may be a little bit of a stretch because you're not directly collaborating with the authors that you're making fan content for, but you kind of are at the same time. Like if I write a book and then you read that book and you're like, man, that's awesome. I'm going to then write a story where I take these characters that that you, in this context, you as me, has written, and then I'm going to write them in a different, universe where they run a coffee shop. That's a specific flavor of fan fiction, which I love. At some point in the future, one of the episodes I'm going to do is just going to be like, hey, fan fiction's crazy. And it is. I love it. I love how specific and, like, it's just really fun. We're not going to get to that right now. But, yeah, I'm going to write a thing where these characters that you created are running a coffee shop. And, that's the story. It's these characters who are, let's just say, from the book that I'm currently working on, this epic fantasy with a lot of, like, war and death and pain. They're all running a coffee shop together. And that's the simple fact that that's an idea is crazy and such an example of, like, you've collaborated with me by you're taking my characters and then you're iterating on that by putting these characters in the context of running a coffee shop. And then, you make the drastic changes that you need to in order to make that work. Some people will look at that and be like, oh, but they could just write their own book with their own stuff and take, like, some vague inspiration from you instead of just stealing your characters in that. And to that I say, okay, yes, that's true, but are you going to deny the fact that it's genuinely cool that they managed to make that story work at all? Like, hey, be a little more gracious. They took my epic fantasy characters and they put them in a modern day coffee shop, and it kind of slaps. It's kind of an awesome little shorts, like a little collection of chapters that they wrote. That was really cool. You're going to deny that effort just because they didn't take it one step further? No. Just because the iteration isn't a complete, amalgamation of a ton of different things doesn't mean it was not an iteration. Doesn't mean it didn't do something to kind of further the, just further the evolution of storytelling. You might not like the way that it moved, but it's still cool that it did. And I think that that's a thing that we should talk about a little bit more, which is why I'm talking about it. So yeah, collaboration and iteration is one of the ways that we all kind of collectively as storytellers grow together. We consume things. Those things we consume influence how we make ideas. We put those new ideas out in the stuff we make. Other people consume them, iterate, and so on and so forth. It's how we got from the Epic of Gilgamesh to Legends and Lattes, and it is how we'll get from Legends and Lattes to whatever happens in the future. And I think that's very exciting, and I think that fan content is a huge and kind of not super well explored, like, version of that. Like, I don't think there has been, like, I think fan fiction's honestly kind of like this is completely off the, like, original script. Like, I genuinely, I'm thinking about it right now, and I'm like, I do not think that fan content has really existed kind of at any other point in history, or at least not to the same degree that it does now. Like, I'm trying to think of a time it would have been possible to make the types of fan content we do, and I cannot think of a time before, maybe not before the early 2000s, but, like, before, like, maybe the late 80s, the latest. I'm saying a lot of things. I have not done any of the research on these numbers. I do not remember when these are, but, like, it is not before, probably not before the 80s. Like, not before the late 80s do I think it was possible to make the types of fan content that we see today. And, like, types of fan content we see today are wildly different than what they made in the 80s. Like, it's just such a cool little, like, sphere on its own of stuff that, like, it's just really, really cool. Like, I'm willing to put money on the fact that Legends and Lattes, the person who wrote it, has at least consumed Coffee AU fan fiction more than once. Like, I'm willing to put money down on that. Maybe not money on account of I don't have it, but I'm willing to stake something on that. I'm gonna look into that because I think that'd be really interesting if that was the case. But yeah, I went on a little bit of a tangent there because I was just thinking about, like, hey, this is kind of like a modern invention. Modern, like, what would that be? Like, not 70 years, 40. Yeah, 40 years. Like, 40 years, which still is, like, crazy recent in the grand scale of the history of the written word. Okay, I'm going to off-road from this so that we can actually continue the episode. But yeah, collaboration, iteration, it's very, very cool and creates new things like Legends and Lattes. I'm going to stand on this hill. Legend and Lattes would not exist without the fan fiction sphere in the way that it is. I am so certain about that. So certain that I'm not cutting this out of the episode. The last point that I have on this like aspects list that I have written is imitation is the highest form of flattery. So this is kind of talking back to us, like standard original creators. I don't know why I keep saying us. I have been on both sides of this fence. I think a lot of creators have been on both sides of this fence. There's not really a difference between a normal creator and a fan creator. It's just what you're making, which like, okay, cool. Imitation is the highest form of flattery. What do I mean by that? If you make something and then people start making things centered around that thing you made, regardless of, how they're doing it and whether you like how they're doing it, there is still an incredibly serious and incredibly, like, special thing about that. Like, even if the fan stuff they're making goes completely against what you want and you're like shocked and appalled, you're like, oh gosh, I didn't want my Victorian romance characters running a car garage. Even if that's true, people still made something based off of your property. And that's awesome, right? That should be awesome. Like, even if you hate what they make, they're still making it. And you didn't ask them to. And that should just be cool. Alright. So, the last point that I'll make before we before we end here today, is this is more of a like, I think imperative, I forget. This is like a thing this is a recommendation. As a creator, should you read fan content based around your own stuff? So I don't really know, as I've not been in this position yet, but I've heard that it's not necessarily a great idea if you're still in the process of writing stuff. Just not necessarily needing to separate yourself from the fans. I think like there's a lot to be gained from interacting with your fans and all of that. But there is a level of like, you shouldn't consume people's ideas about your thing while you're in the middle of making that thing, because their ideas will leak in and start kind of screwing with stuff. I'm not saying that you should avoid it at all costs. I don't think like you'll die if you do. I think there's a lot to be gained from seeing how people are interpreting the things that you made. It's a lot of good information about how well you're doing and all that, and like cool ideas that you can find. But there is something to be said about like how it can be harmful to the stories that you're making. I think this was Brandon Sanderson, but I don't actually know. It was some writer, might have been a show writer. I forget who this was, but I think it was a he. He said that he avoided fan content because he didn't want it to, like get into the show or book or whatever that he was writing. And yeah, there's valid. It's kind of a case by case thing. But in general, I would recommend, if you're actively writing something, to probably not go out of your way to consume fan content. Specifically like fan fiction and like narrative things. Like, you can look at fan art for the most part. And it's not going to like mess with your head too much. But there's like a level of, be mindful. Know yourself, know how it'll get into your writing process and all of that, or your creation process, whatever. And that's basically it. It's like, just be mindful, know yourself. At least don't consume it in large doses, would be like my actual straight up recommendation. Is like, if you're going to, don't consume a ton, because, you make what you eat, and the more like fan things you consume, I don't necessarily know that ideas inbreed, but I don't really want to find out personally. So, just being aware of that. But that's it. Oh, that's what this says. My notes will sometimes autocorrect while I'm writing them. So down here it says, let's all get alone. And I realized that's supposed to say, let's all get along, which is the end idea that I'm supposed to talk about is like, hey, let's just, original creators and fan creators, hand in hand, understand that we all make things, we all enjoy making things, and it should be fun, and we don't need to be upset about it. Fan creators, respect the original creators, treat your fan creators well, please. That's all I'm asking you to do. And people who are consuming from both sides, don't stoke flames if they don't need to be stoked. But yeah, that's basically everything. That's all the things. So thank you all so much for coming and speaking with me for episode 4. If you've made it this far, I assume that you're just kind of along for the ride, and I'm very happy to have you. We've got a pretty decent amount of episodes all plotted out. I have more research to do for a couple of them, which is going to be fun. But yeah, I'm very excited to be doing this. And I'm very excited that you have decided to listen to me talk to myself for so long. But that's all from me for today. So, yeah, I guess that's it. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, night, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. Thank you so much for coming, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.